Everybody hear me? Yes, thank you. I first want to say thank you to the Boston Public Library for having me, and for Michelle LeBlanc, who works in the MAP Center, who has been a supporter of mine and did a little story on the book. So thank you very much. And I'm going to talk for maybe about 15 minutes and then open it up for questions. On August 21st, 1902, William Monroe Trotter led a group of Black lawyers, ministers, and community leaders to the Massachusetts State House. The group was there to protest the recent arrest and upcoming extradition of a North Carolina field hand named Monroe Rogers. Rogers and his group wanted Governor Winthrop Murray Crane to prevent Rogers' return to North Carolina for arson. 1 year earlier, in 1901, two Black boys, ages 14 and 17, were brutally lynched in Greensboro while sitting in jail on vagrancy charges. It was no wonder then that Rogers fled his home state of Charlotte for his mother's house in Massachusetts after confronting his landlord over unpaid wages. The white man's barn mysteriously burned down days after the confrontation, and there was no guarantee that the 22-year-old Black man would receive a fair hearing. Rogers fled to Brockton, where he sought refuge with family and kin. He was arrested there 1 year later after his arrival, after North Carolina's safety commissioner alerted Massachusetts of Rogers' whereabouts. His family, faithful subscribers to The Guardian, since it first appeared in 1901, immediately contacted Trotter, who mobilized Black attorneys, the Black Red Racial Protective Agency, and local churches to demand Rogers' release under a writ of habeas corpus. Before Governor Winthrop Murray Crane, Trotter and his group argued that failure by North Carolina to enforce the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as evidence in the state's unwillingness to investigate or prosecute the recent lynching of the teenage Black boys, prevented Rogers from receiving a fair trial. The 200 Black men and women who crowded Beacon Street outside the State House to plead Rogers' case represented Trotter's political network of Black New Englanders. Some of these were fellow elites who he met during his 4 years at Harvard from 1891 to 1895. Clement G. Morgan, for instance, graduated from both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. In 1893, Morgan and Trotter rallied their fellow Black college students against segregated barbershops in Cambridge. That first protest led Massachusetts Governor Russell to revise the state's civil rights laws. The Black man at the center of that case, William Henry Lewis, was Morgan's classmate at Harvard Law School. A graduate of Williams College and a gifted scholar athlete who went on to coach football at Harvard, Lewis's inability to get a haircut at a white-owned barbershop during commencement exercises in 1893 prompted Lewis and Trotter's first civil rights protest. As an attorney who was elected to the Cambridge Common Council and the state legislature, Lewis answered Trotter's call when the Guardian editor asked Boston's small yet significant class of Black attorneys and law students to defend Rogers in court. Although these men represented the elite faction of Trotter's Black New England network, the Guardian editor also had ties to Greater Boston's Black activist infrastructure that connected Trotter to Black working people across the region. From Woburn, Baptist minister William H. Scott used his racial protective agency to publicize Rogers' case amongst Black communities in Boston's far-flung northern suburbs. From Cambridge, Reverend Timothy Tice organized Black parishioners in his St. Paul's AME church to travel to Brockton by train, where they offered constant prayer and donations to Rogers' family. In the weeks leading up to the Trotter Group's meeting with Governor Crane, Tice staged gatherings of Black men, women, and children outside the State House in Boston Common, waving copies of The Guardian and providing rousing sermons that proclaimed, quote, the Reconstruction Amendments are not dead, and exhorted the crowd to, quote, demand what is ours by birthright. During the meeting with Governor Crane, Trotter, Morgan, Lewis, and their supporters demanded that the Massachusetts Attorney General file a writ of habeas corpus to prevent Monroe Rogers' extradition to North Carolina. And yet in 1902, the notion that militant Black protests could affect civil rights was anathema to the era's racial conservatism. Indeed, public Black radical protest was so distasteful in 1902 that the Boston Globe accused Trotter of, quote, straining things when he connected Massachusetts' responsibility to Rogers to the state's antebellum protests on behalf of Anthony Burns and Shadrach Minkins. The Attorney General was also dismissive of comparisons to the Black radical past. He ruled that Massachusetts had no legal basis for detaining Rogers, and Booker T. Washington, president of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute and the most powerful Black man in the country, confirmed white insistence that Rogers should return to North Carolina for judgment. The school principal, Booker T. Washington, personally contacted North Carolina's governor to advise him against, quote, giving in to what Washington called the unreasonable demands of colored Boston's tiny but vocal minority. Unfortunately for Monroe Rogers, conservative racial accommodation triumphed over radical Black demands for his protection. On August 30th, 1902, as the Attorney General reviewed the writ, Brockton police officers who were supposed to transport Rogers from Boston instead put him on a train back to North Carolina. There, he stood trial for arson and attempted murder, despite lacking an attorney, and even though the white man whose barn he supposedly burned failed to testify. Rogers was ordered to solitary confinement in the state penitentiary for a minimum of 15 years, but died of septic pneumonia 4 years later in 1906. Far from an isolated incident of radical mass protest, the Monroe Rogers protest signaled William Monroe Trotter's decades-long battle, rooted in and defined by Black Boston, against segregation, disfranchisement, lynching, and racial injustice. Over the next 30 years, Trotter shaped similar grassroots protests against the wholesale discharge of Black soldiers from the U.S. military in the Brownsville case in 1906, and racist propaganda in Boston public schools between 1914 and 1929, famously against D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1915, and against employment discrimination at Massachusetts state hospitals, amongst other protests. Although not all of these protests were successful, they galvanized Black people across the diaspora to, as he put it, agitate, agitate, agitate in order to define radical racial justice on their own terms. So who was William Monroe Trotter? Why was he alone among contemporaries in protesting unapologetically, persistently, and radically against racial conservatism and white liberal apathy in the face of radical Reconstruction's betrayal at the turn of the last century? William Monroe Trotter was born in 1872, the year that liberal Republicans broke from their radical colleagues to oppose federal enforcement of the Reconstruction Amendments. He died exactly 62 years later as Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt presided over an administration that fundamentally changed the relationship between federal policy and the American economy. Bookended as he was between the failed promise of radical Reconstruction and the racial limitations of New Deal liberalism, William Monroe Trotter's life represents the radical possibilities of Northern Black politics rooted in transnational Black radicalism. Trotter's life also reconceptualizes Black radicalism as a tradition that thrived and existed outside the rural South, in the urban, predominantly white Northeast, amongst an ethnically and culturally diverse Black community.
Kerri, can we see the rest of the slide?
Oh, sorry. Can you see it now?
Part of it, the edge is getting cut off.
Oh, sorry.
On the left side. That's better, yeah. Thanks.
I first heard about William Monroe Trotter from my grandfather, Samuel Lee Dance, a proud Black veteran of World War II who was raised in Petersburg, Virginia, and who was intensely political despite the fact that he lacked a high school education. He and my grandmother were active in the mold of Howard Thurman, whose Jesus and the Disinherited sat on their bookshelf beside a copy of The Souls of Black Folk. My grandparents were amongst the first African Americans to purchase a house in Arlington during the 1950s, although they spent their lives involved in civil rights work around Greater Boston and New England. It was from them that I learned to look for Black stories beyond the existing scholarship, in supposedly predominantly white places like New England and Boston, as well as distinctly African places like the Mississippi Delta and Haiti. Often my grandfather would pile me, my sisters, my cousins, and any neighborhood kid who happened to be hanging around into his silver Cadillac, We would drive up and down Route 2, west on I-90, or south on I-93, and we would point out places that seemed insignificant. Downtown New Bedford, the fishing shacks on Plum Island, or the woods around Great Barrington and Mount Greylock, where, he said, Black people and Native people set their footprints. He was the first to tell us about slavery in Medford, Cape Verdean labor organizers in Dartmouth, and Black sleeping car porters in the South End. And he was the first to tell me about Trotter. I was homesick, and I was lying on the couch in his living room while he cleaned up from brunch and watched a midday local news program. The program was a retrospective on the 10th anniversary of anti-busing protests or riots in South Boston, with images of white people throwing bricks and hurling the N-word at Black children in Roxbury, some of whom my grandparents knew. And I remember my grandfather saying out loud to nobody in particular, none of that would have happened if Trotter were here. When my grandmother came home, I asked her who Trotter was, and she took me in her lap and wrote his name on a piece of paper. She and my grandfather told me that Trotter was, quote, a race man like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. And my grandmother showed me a copy of Stephen R. Fox's 1970 biography, The Guardian of Boston. When I grew up, I found that book in a used bookstore, bought it for $5, and read it cover to cover in one weekend, convinced, like my grandparents, that Black stories are always far more complex than we believe, and that stories like Trotter's ought to be analyzed, discussed, and as studies and stories of Du Bois, Garvey, King, and Malcolm X. It has been my hope with Black Radical to reorient the scholarship toward these stories, not as a form of hagiography or racial exceptionalism, but as a way to challenge ourselves to more completely reckon with our racial history. I'm going to close with a quote on the importance of biography and community stories in African American and American studies scholarship, a quote by Nell Irvin Painter, who states, beyond even the most finely tuned categories lies something exceeding race, class, and gender, individual subjectivity. I remain convinced, Painter says, that historians should keep in sight the fundamental lessons of psychology and psychoanalysis, that all people, even people who describe themselves primarily as raced or gendered, are individuals, that individual subjects develop within families, that families need not be related biologically, that attachment does not necessarily connote positive feeling, that attachment and grief do not stop at social barriers of color or class. Families at every economic level inculcate the finest and basest of values. Thank you. And I will open it up for questions. I think see Judy Fines. I'm sorry.
So there's one question about how were you able to determine that he committed suicide?
By his death certificate and by looking into the family reaction to his initial death. I realized that many people, when I went into studying Trotter, had an idea about Trotter's death that he had been pushed. And that is completely understandable given that Trotter, as early as 1919, was being surveyed by what became the FBI, but the Bureau of Investigation. But by the 1930s, as I say in the book, Trotter was depressed, according to both of his sisters. He was treated for nervous exhaustion 4 times between 1931 and 1934. By 1934, right before his birthday, he got notice that the Guardian had been bankrupt, and it had gone bankrupt before, but this time he was not going to be able to publish it after 33 years of publishing it faithfully every Saturday. What he didn't know was that his sister and his brother-in-law, Doc Stewart, purchased the last little bit of the Guardian and were able to republish it, but he didn't know this at the time. They reported that night, when he thought that the newspaper couldn't be published again, he started pacing. His friend Cyril Briggs reported that he had talked many times about ending it all and jumping from the roof, quote unquote. When he ended up jumping from the roof onto the ground, he was picked up and he was actually still breathing. And when they put him on the stretcher, he said, "I want to die, I want to die." And his original birth certificate said that it was by self-inflicted. His sister Maud, immediately in contacting friends, said in her letters that he had died due to suicide. Given the constructs of the time, the 1930s, within a week of his death, Maud was changing her mind, and she said that it was a private family matter and that he had fallen from the roof. But this was at the time not something that was considered controversial by any means, but it is something that particularly for like my grandparents' generation, was like, oh, somebody must have pushed him, or he must have come to a sorry end. But in my research, I did not find I found evidence that pointed to the fact that he was distressed and that he jumped to his death.
Okay, we have a question from Judy and Bruce Bell. Okay.
Hi there. I read your book. I have an autographed copy. I got it as a gift from my son.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's there are a lot to learn in there. I started typing this. It's somewhat of a long question, but let's get to it. You detail and describe in great detail how he met Woodrow Wilson, supported him for governor of New Jersey, supported him for president in 1912, and then his words carried weight, of course, brought a lot of other voters with him, and then was essentially betrayed. I mean, Wilson more than acquiesced and pushed for the continuing segregation of the federal government at as many levels as you could imagine back then. Let's fast forward. This is a busy, active political guy who wouldn't miss a chance. Wilson in 1916 barely squeaked by as president to Charles Evans Hughes. It was one of the closest elections since, W.E.B. Truman. But you don't have much in your book about what I would have expected, that he would have endorsed Hughes or endorsed something, or at least talked about this. Can you just
okay, so one of the things I say in the book is that Trotter did not supporting presidential candidates, he refused to do throughout his career. He never in the Guardian told Black people who to vote for, because he thought that was what they were being told by various sources. He was, since the 1890s, was a political independent, which meant that he voted for all types of people. He urged Black people to vote on the local level for Democrats and on the federal level for Republicans. By the time Hughes came around in 1916, and I have a footnote in this in the book, Trotter was through with publicly stating that Black people should vote for anybody. And he was critical of Hughes because Hughes, of course, was a Republican, and Trotter believed that the Republican Party had betrayed African-American voters going all the way back to the end of Reconstruction. So he did not urge anybody to vote for Hughes. By that point, it's 1916, and Trotter was in the midst of protesting very locally against segregated hospitals in Massachusetts. And so the only thing I could find in the Guardian about his referencing Hughes was saying that, that we are between two fires. Once again, this is a direct quote, "I urge you to vote your conscience." So by 1916, even though Hughes was running, Trotter was not, given his experience with the one time he did tell Black people to vote for somebody, it was Wilson. He did not tell them to vote for Hughes.
Thank you.
Other question? I see somebody said, there are a few of us here from Hyde Park. Hello. Do you have any information on his early life in Hyde Park and his relationship with Archibald Grimke? I do. The whole first part of the book, the first chapter, is all about his family's history. They moved to Hyde Park in the early 1870s. By that point, Trotter's father, James Monroe Trotter, had lived in the city proper for many years as he was working and was appointed a federal appointment to the post office in Boston. Hyde Park at the time was the country, as you probably know, and it was the one place where there was this huge real estate boom in the early 1870s. So there were all these people suddenly moving into the area and buying property. Some of the people who moved there were former abolitionists, so the Grimke's and Mehitabel Sunderland, who was a radical woman abolitionist. And Mehitabel Sunderland was known to rent property to Black people. She was known, this was kind of like the folk wisdom that went through the community. There's letters that she wrote to the Grimke's indicating that she would happily rent to Black people, but she didn't sell to them. By 1870, there were a few Black families who lived there. There was the Depression of 1873, which I point to and outline in the book. And due to that depression, property prices, fell. And so white people in Hyde Park who had moved there in the past 5 years sold. It was like a sort of a whole selling off. And James Trotter went in and purchased 2 houses adjacent to each other on William Street. And that's how, I surmise, that's how he was able to get into the market in Hyde Park. They lived in the Fairmount district, which at the time was the exclusive area. The few Black families who lived in Hyde Park at the time lived in the Reedville section. And over the years, James Trotter Sr. purchased multiple properties sort of in that area. So I have a lot of information in there about them. His friends, Trotter Jr.'s friends as he was growing up were the Gould family, who were a Black family who lived in the Reedville section, and the Grimke's. So Angelina Weld Grimke, Archibald Grimke's daughter, who became the famous poet, lived with her white aunt and uncle in the house that was behind where the Trotters lived. So they knew Angelina Weld Grimke, and I go into the book and sort of that the community that they grew up with in there. Somebody says, could you talk about Trotter and the status of Boston's Black community in relation to class, country of origin, et cetera? How was he viewed by his peers? So Trotter, one of the things that when I was doing my research on the book, that I was pleasantly surprised at was this notion that somehow Trotter was provincial and that he wasn't really popular outside of Boston was just simply not true. If you looked at the newspaper accounts of Black communities across the country, and indeed Black communities in the Bahamas, in Jamaica, and across the Caribbean. And so he was really seen, when he came out with The Guardian in 1901, he was really seen as somebody who was speaking to a current of Black politics that was not being addressed by either Du Bois, who got his doctorate in 1895, or by Washington, who by that point was the most powerful Black man in the country at the time. And so Trotter really spoke to those people. His newspaper, while it was never like a bestseller, given the records I could find, it was something that became kind of like a community piece, right? It became something that people read. Melnia Cass, who we call the first woman of Roxbury, she said that she was first introduced to politics by her mother-in-law, who sold The Guardian. And she talks a lot about in her papers how her mother-in-law would just have stacks of them, and noted that, Trotter was not a good businessman, so he didn't always sell them. He would give them out to people because he really saw it as cultivating this radical consciousness. So he was very well loved by his peers. He was very controversial, however, among segments of the Black political establishment over the years, due to his own personality, as I go into the book, and also due to the fact that he really was adamant that Black people, number one, should not be consenting to what he called imported bosses. He wanted to make sure that the Black press was independent, and before he came along, that was Black press that was written, that was in the minority. The majority of Black papers published in the early 20th century were subsidized by one of the two political parties or by Booker T. Washington. And so Trotter believed that meant that Black people couldn't express themselves freely. And so that made him very, very popular when I was doing the research, in terms of just how he was beloved by people who aren't normally talked about in the scholarship. These weren't people who were reading W.E.B. Du Bois. In fact, A. Philip Randolph stated that Trotter was phenomenal because he related to the people in the street, whereas A. Philip Randolph said, when Philip Randolph himself went to New York and he tried to talk to Du Bois, who he idolized, Du Bois would not talk to the average person in the street, right? Not a judgment on Du Bois, but sort of gives an idea of Trotter's appeal to the masses. So he was very popular amongst African Americans. He was also very popular amongst Boston's community that I go into in the book about the way that he conceptualized race and blackness. Trotter was somebody who grew up around all different types of Black people in Boston. Boston had a distinction in the decades after the Civil War of being the only city other than New York that had a large minority, anywhere between 15 and 20% of Black people born outside of the United States. So that means very, very early on, there were people from Cape Verde, there were people from Haiti, there were people from Barbados, there were people from all over the diaspora, and he grew up around those people. And so his newspaper had an appeal to them, right? So in 1904, he's covering the presidential elections in America, but he's also covering a peasant revolt in Jamaica, right? In 1905, he had for about a few weeks, he had a column that was written in Haitian Creole, because there was a migration of Haitians to Boston at the time. So he really, really was somebody who had, if you read the newspapers that he published and sort of the reaction in the newspapers, that had this appeal beyond just Boston. Somebody asked, what was the conflict between Booker T. Washington and Trotter? So I go into this in the book, and I really wanted in the book when I was writing it to get into the fact that you have these two men, Trotter and Washington, who come from completely different traditions within the Black intellectual tradition, right? Trotter's family mother was part of an abolitionist tradition between Virginia and Ohio, which I go in the book. She could remember traveling with her parents, with fugitive slaves in the wagon over the mountains from Virginia to make sure they went to safety. His father, James Monroe Trotter, was born enslaved in Mississippi, escaped to Cincinnati, where he was basically raised amongst radical abolitionists, both Black and white. So Trotter grew up with that consciousness. Washington, as I go into the book, grew up, was born enslaved in Western Virginia, grew up at a time when to go to school and to inquire about things politically was not encouraged in his particular experience, which is why he got up and he went to Hampton to try to get educated. And Washington was somebody who was in many ways controlled by white interests to create this institution called Tuskegee. And so Trotter was somebody who was critical of Washington because Washington, he believed, was a hypocrite, right? And Washington was saying things politically for the Black community that were undermining any efforts to protest for civil rights, right? And so Trotter's was determined that the problem was not just Washington, it was that Black people needed to have a vehicle, the press, with which to question many of the things Washington was saying at the time. Washington was a conservative, right? And he truly believed that Black people should set aside their what he called their specific political grievances, although what he meant was the right to vote, and should concentrate on the land and should concentrate on building themselves up by their bootstraps. And Trotter's argument was that Black people had worked, as he said, for hundreds of years for other people, and therefore they did not need to work anymore to prove themselves. They needed civil rights before the law. So that was their main difference with each other. And I go a lot into like the ways in which Washington tried to undermine the Guardian. Trotter was sued at least 3 times by Washington, and then another 2 times by people who Washington supported. And because Trotter had his own set of money, he couldn't be bought by Washington, which was also a source of their conflict. Somebody says, I grew up near Sawyer Avenue, Jones Hill, which was where Trotter and his wife lived. Is Trotter's house landmarked in any way to make his historical present contributions to Boston and U.S. history? Yes, so the house is privately owned, but it is has been deemed a historic landmark. So it is a landmark. The house on um, uh, historic, the National Commission of Historic Places. People are asking about the Birth of a Nation protest, which is one of my favorite ones. So one of the things I tried to stress in the book was that Trotter's radicalism came from his belief that Black people should decide their own racial destiny, that racial destiny was imbued with the history they had of protest and of representing themselves, not just in an American context, but in kind of a diasporic world context. And he was very concerned with the ways in which Black history was being lied about by the time he was alive. So we have to remember, he's born in 1872, and his father becomes a federal appointee in the early 1880s. He lived through Reconstruction, albeit in the North, and he lived through seeing many of his father's friends were Black elected officials who would sit around the table and talk about how the things they were doing in the South that were education-wise and voting and mobilizing Black voters. And so at the same time, Trotter is growing up with that as a little boy, he's hearing this rhetoric go around that was prevalent at the time and to this day, which was that Reconstruction was a mistake, that Black people shouldn't have been allowed to vote or hold office, and that therefore lynching and racial violence was justified. So he's living through this in real time, even as he's hearing people in his family, particularly his father, talk about what actually was going on in Reconstruction. And so by the time a series of books came out in the late 1890s and early 1900s, which were written by Thomas Dixon, and Thomas Dixon was a rabid white supremacist, right? There's evidence that members of his family helped found the Klan in his home state. And Thomas Dixon was somebody who believed that slavery was wrong, but he did not believe that, oh, sorry, can people hear that in the background? Yes, I apologize. Okay, there we go. It's my house, my big house out here with the thing. But anyway, so he was Thomas Dixon was somebody who wrote these series of novels that were one of them was called The Leopard Spots, which the whole argument of the novels, and Thomas Dixon was very explicit about that, was that Black people had ruined the South, that although slavery was regrettable, it had tamed Black people, and that the Ku Klux Klan had rescued white Southerners from Black rule. And so when Trotter saw these books, which were extremely popular, one of his first campaigns was to not allow them to be taught in the Boston public schools, which was, they were considered so popular that people were teaching them when kids were learning how to read, they would give them out in classrooms. And so that's the book that Birth of a Nation was based upon, right? And so beginning in 1901, Trotter had been working against this myth, right? He got the Thomas Dixon books prevented from being taught in public schools in Boston, but then there was a famous roadshow that Thomas Dixon did that interpreted the books that he tried to get canceled in Boston as well. By 1915, when the Birth of a Nation film came out, in other words, Trotter had seen this myth become a justification for policy, right? So by 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt summarily discharges all members of a Black battalion in Texas who were the victims of racial harassment, when Theodore Roosevelt did that, one of his rationalizations for doing that was that Black people had never done anything for the country. All you had to do was read Thomas Dixon, right? So Trotter's response to the Birth of a Nation in the book, I'm very careful to say, did not, in his mind, have anything to do with censorship. It really had to do with the fact that this was dangerous, that it was creating in the United States and justifying white, very, very dramatic white racial violence. And actually, he was right. When the Birth of a Nation was shown in Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia, the white reaction was so great that whites in Stone Mountain, Georgia, used that to found the new Ku Klux Klan in 1915. So Trotter's approach was that he believed that the film should be stopped when it couldn't be stopped. He supported efforts to have it censored, although his argument was that there was no way to censor the film, right? And that the real purpose was that had nothing to do with the film. It had to do with this hateful, basically racist propaganda that was being shown across the country. Another thing to kind of point out is that when the film was shown in Boston, one of the fights he did not win, Trotter was one of the only people who was concerned that whenever the film would like arrive in a city, Ku Klux Klan people would march down the streets because it was like to promote the film. So he was not merely, in my book, I kind of go a lot into the background of the film and Trotter's relationship to this propaganda. Trotter was, unlike sort of the NAACP and other groups at the time, did not believe that it was a matter of you just need to educate people about Reconstruction, which was kind of the NAACP's approach, or merely get certain scenes taken out, right? Trotter, of course, supported that in the long run, but he also argued that this was the dangers of this, right? That it had real consequences for Black people, for Jewish people, for Catholic people, right? Because of the rhetoric that it was spewing. Can you speak about Trotter's view of Hubert Harrison? So Hubert Harrison and Trotter were close. They both founded the Liberty League, which became the only radical civil rights movement to meet group to meet during World War I. I have a whole section in there about the Liberty League and Hubert Harrison. Hubert Harrison, when he started writing Africa Awakes, part of his scholarship is coming from The Guardian. So Trotter wrote an article in The Guardian. Hubert Harrison then adapted it for his own writings. Similarly, Hubert Harrison would write in his own paper, and Trotter would adopt it for the Guardian. So they were very, very close. They organized a Liberty League conference in 1918. That conference was what led Trotter to go to Paris to present the demands of the colored people for world democracy. That's what they called it. Harrison, however, was like many people put off by Trotter's personality. So Trotter was very, very difficult, and I say this in book talks all the time. He probably was not somebody who would have been pleasant to be around kind of on a day-to-day basis, just as a friend and as a person. And so they had a falling out in the early 1920s. But when Hubert Harrison died, Trotter was one of the first people to send a letter to his family to basically say, to mourn his death. And Trotter rarely did that to anybody, right? When people died, he kind of just held it in and he didn't send out letters, and he was one of the ones. So a close relationship. Somebody says, I know this is tricky to speculate, but what do you think Trotter would have to say about the pros and cons of renaming Faneuil Hall because of Peter Faneuil's engagement in the transatlantic slave trade? I think that Trotter, one of the famous lines that he would say was that we can't, what is it? Let me find it in the book. We can't depend for our freedom on baubles and mere expressions of equality, right? All the baubles and changes in the world that are incidental are not necessarily good for the race in the long term. So he basically is saying that he was very critical of the idea that Black people focusing a lot of their protest onto things that he saw as not having a kind of effect on the racial capitalist system that he was so critical of, right? So he was when there was an argument in 1917 over a program at the Crispus Attucks Monument, which was the Crispus Attucks Monument was created and designed by Black people. And there was a whole sort of outcry that that monument needed to be replaced. And Trotter said, oh, it could be replaced. Black people had the right to decide that. But he said, how dare we distract ourselves by focusing on a monument when we should be focusing on the colored peoples of the world. So he was somebody who controversially or not, would say that kind of you had to go engage in the long game. You had to take steps that would lead to liberation and not merely be kind of what he called frequently window dressing. That's not to say that's what the present protest is about, but it's to say that his reaction to many previous protests was that way. Trotter later had success blocking a reissue of Birth of a Nation in Boston during the 1920s. He got one version of the film later censored in Boston, but the film continued to play, right, in the city like it did in most cities. Boston was the only city that ended up taking out versions of it, and when the film was re-released in the 1920s, one of those runs, Boston did not have it play. But I don't want to give the impression that Boston somehow didn't play the film. Because they did, and that was kind of Trotter's point. And Trotter also was responding to Boston being a famous city for censorship, right? There was a statement called "Banned in Boston," which was kind of the notion that artists couldn't show anything in Boston. And so one of the things he pointed out in that protest was that why were all these other things being easily being censored, and yet the Birth of a Nation was allowed to stand. Other questions? Any questions?
Are you working on another book?
I am working on another book. I am. I have. It's actually a biography of the Grimke's, the Black Grimke's, and their relationship with the Grimke sisters, and the role that family trauma can play in Black politics. So I should be working on it this evening, but I'm talking with you guys, so I have a deadline that's next Monday with it, but.
Did Trotter expound on what we would call spatial justice today? That is rights to be in a public space?
Huh. Well, yeah. I mean, he was somebody who argued against segregation, right? He was somebody who, in 1893, when he had that first protest along with William Henry Lewis and at Harvard, argued that the state's civil rights laws needed to be strengthened so that no place could be segregated. Interestingly, Boston or Massachusetts was the first state to pass an anti-segregation law in 1865. So that's before passage of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And actually, there's evidence that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was modeled after the way the law was written in Massachusetts. So Trotter, throughout his life, was somebody who pushed to make sure that that law was strengthened, that it evolved over time. So definitely he was somebody who believed or was concerned with those things.
So somebody asked about the issues of The Guardian, I think it is. So the Boston Public Library does have copies on microfilm.
Yes.
Not all of them, but many of them.
Yeah, so part of doing this book and part of why it took me so long is that there's most of mine, thanks to the Boston Public Library, most of the best versions of the paper are in the Boston Public Library. They're also at the Congregational Library on Beacon Street. They're also in various archives at the Bancroft Library in California, at Fisk University. And then a lot of it was digging into personal papers of other people, his contemporaries, who often kept articles of the pieces of the Guardian there. Trotter also had correspondence with people like Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey kept, for a period, kept issues of the Guardian attached to the Negro world. So it's kind of like a wild goose chase trying to find issues of the Guardian. They're hard to come by because aside from the ones that are in the Boston Public Library, they're kind of in disparate places. Oh, also in the collection, the Trotter collection that's at the Boston University. Somebody says, by the time Trotter died, what kind of discriminatory practices remained characteristic in Boston? So one of the things that Trotter was very critical of was the fact that despite the fact that Massachusetts had passed the Civil Rights Act in 1865, despite the fact that African Americans in the state by 1910 had the highest literacy rate of any Black community in the country, and by 1910 had elected Black representatives to city councils across the state, not just in Boston, and school committees and state legislatures. Despite all of this, right, Trotter was very critical of the fact that economically Black people were denied what he called the bounty of the state, right? So Massachusetts between 1865 and 1915 has this huge economic boom, not unlike what happened before COVID in Boston and the region, right? There's this huge boom. There's all these people migrating to Boston. It expands, and Trotter would point out that one of the things that happened was that Black people were systematically kept out of that boom, and that they were prevented, for instance, from investing in property, except in certain areas. That they were literally denied entry into certain places of employment. So one of the things that struck Trotter was that when he graduated from Harvard in 1895, he graduated third in his class. He was already very well known by white people who had supported his father, and he could not find a job in Boston because no place would hire him. And he kept on seeing all of these people who ranked below him that were getting jobs ahead of him. And so this was something that he fought for. So to answer your question, how did segregation exist by the time he died? Boston at the time, by the 1930s, due to the policies of the Roosevelt administration, instituted all this redlining, and this is, historians have gone into this, that basically allowed poorer white people to move from the cities into other areas, suburbs, for instance, and Black people were kept out. And Trotter always pointed out that there was a disease, he called it a disease in Boston, of the white liberal, which he said was that a majority of white Protestant people in Boston didn't believe that Boston had a racial problem. And so what that meant was that as the years went on, there weren't a lot of policies that prevented Black people from being economically exploited, right? For instance, in Boston had a huge industrial sector on the railroads and factories and stuff. Black people were not allowed in those industries, not by law, but just by practice, right? They didn't hire Black people. So they're cut out of all of these mainstream jobs, despite the fact that they had the highest literacy rate of any Black community, and despite the fact that they had, for a time, the highest literacy rate of any non-Protestant group in the city of Boston. So by the time he died, right, this was one thing that, again, when he was sort of despairing in his final years, that he pointed to, right? One of his most heartbreaking quotes is that, I've struggled so much for them, he says in 1933, and yet the city remains the same. So he was very sort of upset that kind of the economic, which of course is connected to race, had left many Black people with little economic mobility. Other questions?
What was his stance on reparations?
So again, this is the context in which Trotter lived. There was a huge reparations movement that was actually created by someone named Marion Emma Barry. I know her last name is Barry. I'm messing up on the first name, but she was a formerly enslaved woman who started sort of this reparations movement in 1865. Trotter's uncle, William Dupree, was involved in that movement in Boston. Trotter himself's argument, and again, he's living, just a few years after the Civil War ends, was that Black people should have rights to, number one, the Homestead Act, which allowed poor white people mostly to basically have a stake in Native American land in the West. He argued that Black people should be the first to receive that, even though they were not. And so in terms of reparations, he did not use the term reparations. That's a relatively new term, just in terms of African-American discourse. That doesn't mean the movement did not exist. It existed, going back to the 19th century. but he did not use those specific terms. But in his life, his argument was that Black people deserve to have a stake in the wealth. And he's living at a time when America's wealth was being built, right? And can very pointed in The Guardian to all these examples of where Black people should be given priority, given their free labor to the country.
So Phil Trotter asks, what gave you the interest in Trotter as a historical figure?
Oh, so I talked about this a little bit in the talk. I basically said, my grandparents were activists, and they lived in Massachusetts, and they both sets of grandparents, my father's side of the family is from Barbados, were very always told me and my sisters and my cousins that Black people were much more complicated than scholars and historians, even Black ones, would have us believe. And so my grandfather would always tell us that we had to look for Black people even in places where we didn't think Black people existed. And my grandfather was the first one to say the name Trotter to me. And so when I went to graduate school, I was really determined that I wanted to study Black politics, the way it intersected with Black politics across the diaspora, and what that looked like outside of the places we usually look, like New York City, Chicago, the South, right? Not because I think that those places are better or worse, but because I just want to see how does that change the way we look at Black people in Black discourse. And so when I did my dissertation, I had a whole chapter on Trotter, and it was frustrating because I couldn't find any secondary work that was written after Stephen Fox's book. And so it was very hard to find like something that talked about him. And everywhere I went, people were just saying, oh, he stopped being active after 1915, right? And I kept seeing that wasn't true. So when I got the doctorate, I then wanted to make sure that I wrote something about Trotter that showed, used Trotter's life as a lens through which to talk about race and Black radical politics in Boston and how that then affected transnational Black politics. Somebody asked, what do you think Trotter would make of our current atmosphere of American political debate in terms of race and the delayed promises of Reconstruction? So Trotter, as I said before, was somebody who lived through seeing how Reconstruction was denigrated, right? So in very real time, he was seeing, on one hand, Black people who had voted and held office in the South, and on the other hand, hearing people say that was a bad thing, right? So it's kind of like nowadays when people who grew up like in the 60s and 70s, who say many of the political arguments we're having seem like they've just been restructured, right? And didn't we go through this before? So that was often Trotter's response to things. So I imagine that if he were alive now, it would be a similar thing, right? Why didn't people, number one, know history, even people who lived through it, right? And so who knew very well that Reconstruction wasn't what they said it was, right? It's similar to people now who claim that certain policies were the ruin of the United States, and people who lived through it know that was not true, right? If you lived through like the 70s and 80s, there's certain things that now certain political characters try to say happen, didn't happen. So he was definitely somebody who was very aware of political gaslighting and the fact that the discourse of the United States about itself and race was often being rewritten, even as race and politics were happening.
Is there any other questions for Kerri? Well, thanks so much, Kerri. We really appreciated your talk. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry about the screen. You'd think teaching I would be more Zoom savvy, but I am not Zoom savvy. So I was trying to split my screen and it was a mess. So thank you. And thank you for having me.